Hi, everyone. Welcome to AE911Truth Webinars. This is Richard Gage, AIA. I'm the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and I'm a 29-year architect and member of the American Institute of Architects. And we'll be discussing today what has evolved from our original presentation, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, which we are developing into now a three-part series. Often it has been a 4-week seminar, 2 weeks on World Trade Center 7 and 2 weeks on the Twin Towers. We're now developing it into 9/11, an architect's guide, which will be aimed at educating architects across the country who will shortly here be able to earn learning units, continuing education learning units through the American Institute of Architects. We are in part 2 then of this three-part series. We'll be looking at the Twin Towers today, the explosive destruction. I do want to introduce you to my wonderful operations coordinator at AE911 Truth. That's Mr. Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in and viewing this important information and for spreading these webinars to the people that need to see them the most. We will be taking questions, like always, during this webinar about the material presented during the slideshow. So to submit the questions, all you have to do is type your questions into the box beneath the screen at ae911truth.org/webinars, and we'll be taking those at the end of the presentation. As well, YouTube defaults to a low resolution. We can't do anything about that, but you can. All you have to do is click the gearbox beneath the screen, click 720 HD resolution, and you'll see the slides in crisp, clear pictures. So I just wanted to inform everybody of that before we proceed, and I hope you take in the information today and again pass it around to others. Back to you, Richard.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andy. And we'll be seeing Andy at the end of the webinar, because you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions, and Andy will be collecting them, and so we'll see you back there, Andy. You know, we have never had a steel frame high-rise collapse due to fire, so why then did the Twin Towers, which we're talking about today, collapse on 9/11? And the big question is, I mean, we had 3, of course, on World Trade Center on 9/11 at the World Trade Center. And they attributed the collapse, of course, of the Twin Towers to normal office fires. Jet fuel started them, and of course damage by the airplanes to columns. We'll be talking about that today particularly. And so let's see what we're going to be expected to do as a result of this course today. You'll be able to describe the characteristics of building fires, the material properties of steel, and the aspects of design that contributed to make fire-induced failure in steel frame high rises a rare occurrence. In fact, only 3, and all on 9/11. We'll be able to recognize the distinct features associated with fire-induced failure and those associated with controlled demolition. And so we'll also be able to step-by-step describe the series of structural failures that NIST found to be the cause of the collapse of the towers, and analyze the physical evidence and dynamics of the collapses, and see how they're consistent with fire-induced failure or controlled demolition. So to help us in that, today we'll be looking more specifically at explosions, a sudden near free fall collapse, high velocity, lateral ejection, shattering of the steel frame, and the midair pulverization of the concrete. So when we look at the Twin Towers, we've got a lot to consume today, but I wanted you to know a little bit about myself. I've worked on these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school in the San Francisco Bay Area. More recently, though, in the Las Vegas area, this $400 million mixed-use project with 1,200 tons of steel framing, where we have commercial parking garage and mid-rise office building here. But I'm joined by 2,700 now architects and engineers calling for a new investigation of the destruction of the World Trade Center skyscrapers. And you're going to see why they have put their names publicly online, demanding a new investigation. Well, let's then look at the design first. I mean, this was an innovative structure, to say the least, but its design was largely condemned by architects. You can see, for instance, gigantic dumbness, says Robert Stern, versus others cited this sculptural purity of the building's forms in this modern architecture. Well, you can see, compared to the Art Deco design and unfolding massing of the highest building in the world at the time the towers were built, the Empire State Building, that you just, to get the highest building in the world, extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest. So this was quite controversial design-wise. Structural engineering, though, was another matter. Until then, you had a forest of columns traveling through the floor plan, for instance, of the Empire State Building. But in the Twin Towers, it was quite different. The structure was moved largely out to the perimeter in an exoskeleton with 3 pre-manufactured components of 3 verticals, 3 horizontals, and then dropped into place and bolted together, these internally welded components. So it lent itself to rapid fabrication. In the inside, you had a series of 47 massive core columns, here 3 inches thick. And then between the interior core and the exterior, you have these floor panels composed of these lightweight steel trusses spanning up to 60 feet, which allowed for open office planning. You can see that we have 60 feet on the big sides, and the narrow sides 35 feet. This was an innovation structurally, which allowed architectural freedom inside the plan. But there were problems with the Twin Towers. Nevertheless, one of them was these series of marching columns, every 3 feet 4 inches all the way around the building, or 3 feet 9 inches. One of those two. And a relatively low ceiling in this case. I think it's 9 feet. So there's pluses and minuses, and by most researchers' estimations, there was only the buildings were only half occupied, the floors. We have had some trouble documenting the actual occupancy rate in the building, but nevertheless, you had a massive amount of steel in this building, 100,000 tons of it. It's a massive heat sink that could draw away and conduct through the structure the heat from fire, so that localized failure becomes virtually impossible, except in these lightweight steel trusses, where NIST focuses its problem, its theory for the initiation of collapse. We'll get to that. Let's first see what happened here on 9/11 and how this official story began to be developed right away.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here is the official story in a nutshell. And what we're going to do is test that theory with the scientific method. We've had it for 100 years or so. It's been developed in the West, and we formulate a question, basically. How do the towers come down? We do some background research, make some observations. We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess. I think it came down by fire, or maybe it came down by explosions or controlled demolition, plane impacts. All of the rational hypotheses are laid out, and this is how we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. And so we test those hypotheses with experiments. We don't focus in on one hypothesis because of a predilection, a bias, some objectivity, so some lack of objectivity. We analyze the results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of our work. This is how we build faith in the work that's gone on before us, by openness and transparency. And so this is critically important, and we would expect in the investigations, for instance, by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which have produced building reports. They do not release, for instance, their computer data. We don't have access to it. This is not an example of transparency. So we'll be looking at that. But the hypothesis, if it's not corroborated by the evidence, etc., we go back and we construct a new one that is. And so let's apply the scientific method as we look and see how others have done just that, because there were official investigations into these disasters, starting right away with the volunteers from the American Society of Civil Engineers. These particular volunteers were not necessarily biased. They were heavily dependent on federal contracts, and so might have a reason to preserve those in favor of objectivity. And they were not given access to the steel or the structural drawings, as they'd requested several times as well. And these volunteers worked themselves into the FEMA reports, which did finally get some funding. And with this funding, they produced a report that we'll be looking at. This was released in May of 2002. So there was another unpublished was not made public. The Silverstein-Weidlinger report, which is used to support insurance claims, but eventually there was a final report by NIST, who took over this investigation from FEMA, using the same body of individuals largely. So these were not independent investigations at all, actually. So 3 years, $20 million of funding, and we will be looking at what that produced. Again, these individuals worked their way from right up front with the FEMA report largely into the NIST report, and supporting the effort by Popular Mechanics to dislodge the growing questioning about the NIST report and other aspects of what happened on 9/11. We will then be looking at the characteristics of controlled demolition. We did last week in part 1 of An Architect's Guide. So what were they? So we found that there's, in a typical controlled demolition, a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, because demolition waves remove those column supports. Number 4, the building falls generally at or near free fall acceleration, straight down through what was the path of greatest resistance. Number 5, resulting in a total dismemberment of the steel structure. It's broken up, ready for loading and shipment. Number 6, minimal damage to adjacent structures, typically. And then we found that to be the case with respect to Building 7 last week. I think there's something quite different going on with the Twin Towers, as you'll see, relative to damage to adjacent structures. Sounds of explosives heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. Number 8, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete and very hot gases. Number 9, isolated explosive ejections called squibs. And finally, chemical evidence of cutter charges or explosives or incendiaries left behind in the destruction. Now, this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. So if you have these features, you're pretty sure that you have explosive destruction, especially if you have additional corroborating circumstantial evidence like government documentation can be very helpful. Experts agreeing, at least those experts who are not swayed, say controlled demolition experts, swayed by federal contracts of their own, which most controlled demolition companies, for instance, rely upon exclusively for their business. Foreknowledge of destruction, we don't just bring buildings down in a day. It takes months, of course, to plan and execute such, and video documentation. This is all proof of controlled demolition. So we're going to be looking at this series of typical features and atypical features as we look at the Twin Towers. First, the theory by NIST of how this building came down is essentially large, hot, raging fires causing the weakening of the lightweight steel trusses because the airplane impacts were theorized to have knocked off the fireproofing on many of them, causing them to sag due to the heat, and then that pulling in the column. All of, or most of, these exterior columns. Now, there's a few problems with this theory. NIST sagging trusses don't cause much at all of a additional lateral force on these columns, especially 14-inch square steel tube columns, marching every 3 feet 4 inches all the way around the building. So what does NIST do? In their computer model, they force the failure of these columns by imposing a lateral 5,000-pound load, which is inconceivable in terms of the actual lateral loading which should be minimal, by sagging floor trusses. So now the columns did in fact pull in. We'll be looking at what might have caused that. But let's start at the beginning. Do we have a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet plane impacts? And what would be causing that sudden destruction? Would it be sagging floor trusses, or could it be explosions, for which we would be looking for witnesses that heard sounds of these explosions, saw flashes of light? Well, let's look at the oral histories produced by Thomas von Essen, the city's fire commissioner in New York, who said he wanted to preserve these accounts before they became reshaped by a collective memory. So what does he do? He records 500 of his FDNY and emergency technicians in 12,000 pages of testimony produced by these oral reports, all recorded on tape. And the court finally, in 2005, orders the release of to the New York Times. And so we didn't even learn, for another 4 years, that we have 118 of these firefighters observing flashes, hearing sounds, explosions, and other phenomena, which is indicative of explosive demolition. Let's look at a few of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Now listen to the order of this language again and again. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. Not it started coming down, and then you felt this all this phenomena. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. This is 1,000 feet or so below the phenomena of the collapse. So they should be seeing it before feeling it, but no, they're feeling it, indicating explosions. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. It seemed like on television, when they blow up these buildings, it seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Well, let's see what they might be referring to as we look at the demolition, the destruction of the North Tower on the right and the known controlled demolition on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity here to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since fire has never brought down a high-rise in history ever before 9/11 or since. And especially since it looks in these first 4 seconds exactly like a controlled demolition. Should this not have been the first hypothesis that NIST focused on, rather than a hypothesis that's completely unprecedented, the destruction by fire? And their hypothesis is essentially fire. The jet plane impacts did damage and weakened some of the columns and knocked fireproofing off. But that was considered by NIST to mostly assist the then following that, the primary cause of destruction by fire. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and the building had started to explode. Well, let's look at the South Tower, see what its destruction looks like compared to a known controlled demolition. Again, is there any comparison to a controlled demolition? Enough to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Well, let's listen to these news reporters and others, of which we have a few here, but there are hundreds of these witnesses. Here we go.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby. Was it a secondary explosion? Yes, it was.
That was the...
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, like a bomb off. And another explosion came right on because everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That
It sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear an explosion and you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
There's a tower rather that has collapsed, and we are told collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
All my thoughts that are popping out. It was if they had detonated. They were planning to take down a building.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go like firecrackers.
How many of those witnesses, or any witnesses of explosions, occur or are documented in the final report of NIST on the destruction of the Twin Towers? None. Not one. And yet they make the claim that they have interviewed thousands of witnesses. So this is an obvious example of omission, which is critically important for us as building professionals to bring to light and call to question. So NIST did come out and say, well, it couldn't have been a controlled demolition. It didn't start at the bottom like controlled demolitions do? Well, let's see if there's any controlled demolitions that don't start at the bottom.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Here's one. So they don't all have to start at the bottom, clearly. NIST claims that according to the Besant theory, Zdeněk Besant from Northwestern University in Chicago came out 2 days after 9/11 with a very complex series of calculations, claiming that this upper part of the building above the point of jet plane impacts, after the weakening of the structure by fire, then drove the rest of the building down, which NIST acknowledges happened at near freefall, and then destroyed itself. Well, is this possible? According to Newton's third law of motion, there's an equal and opposite destructive force on bodies that collide. If a Volkswagen runs into a Mack truck, what happens? Well, the lighter object is destroyed first. It can't destroy the Mack truck. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No. The lighter part of a lighter object cannot possibly destroy the heavier, cold, hard, intact steel below it. It's a matter of physics. It's very clear. And in fact, that's what happens, actually, when we look at the destruction of the North Tower. Take a look. We see in the first 4 seconds of this building's collapse, the top part is being destroyed. Let's break it down. Take a look. The top part is what's being destroyed first, just like the Volkswagen. The question is, what is destroying it? And we'll be looking at that very critically in a moment. So this completely pulls the rug out from underneath the Zdeněk proof of the initiation of collapse and the whole collapse of this building, and NIST's theory, which follows directly from that. Take a look as we start and then stop. We see, like the firemen described, bands of explosions wrapping all the way around the building. Start and stop right here, just like the fireman described, a belt, like a belt, all these explosions wrapping symmetrically all the way around the building. The top part is then destroyed in 4 seconds. In fact, none of the photos or videos show the top section of this building destroying the bottom section at all. It was already gone in 4 seconds. There's nothing left to destroy the rest of this building. In fact, it is being destroyed very similarly, interestingly enough, to like a volcanic eruption, for instance, in the Tongan Sea in 2009, with upward, outward arching streamers, freely flying laterally ejected structural steel sections trailed by thick white smoke clouds, indicating something very different than a pancaking or gravitational collapse. Is it a collapse, or is it an explosion, or a massive series of explosions? Well, does it look like, just intuitively, a collapse to you? Well, let's look at the South Tower. So here's the South Tower beginning to fall off of its axis, actually, 22 degrees. So we have asymmetrical destruction from the airplane, asymmetrical damage from the fires, and asymmetrical loading from this building mass, which is falling off of the building. And yet, look from below. Complete symmetrical destruction all the way down the length of the building until this particular photographer decided to run anyway. But down below, take a look at what happens. Are we seeing a collapse or a series of explosions hundreds of feet below the zone of destruction, if you will, up above. What are we looking at? Okay. And shattering the structure completely, all the way down to the ground. No building components that are recognizable, save these remaining shards of exterior perimeter walls. And look at the columns and beams themselves, deeply reddened, oxidized, convex on one side, concave on the other, indicating a side concussive blast. And many of these beams in extreme hot temperatures, which we'll get to next week, causing these beams to look like noodles. Do we have a straight down symmetrical progression outside the footprint of this building? In the case of building 7, last week we saw it was an implosion. Something else is going on here. We have a 207-foot wide building, yet the components of it, its structural elements and all the other elements of it, are largely outside that perimeter in a 12 to 1400 foot radius, well outside the boundaries of ground zero, in fact, of the site of the World Trade Center. Landing 600 feet away, damaging for instance, on the left, the Winter Gardens with these freely flying structural steel sections, as we'll see. Compare that to the nice, neat implosion, thus the haystack pile centered in inside the perimeter footprint of Building 7 on the right. A very explosive destruction we're talking about with regard to the Twin Towers. And let's look at some of the examples of that explosive destruction as we look at squibs, or isolated explosive elements occurring here, up to 60 stories below this zone of destruction. There's no explanation that's rational for these. NIST says, well, there was air pressure being produced by that pile driver pushing air down through the elevator hoistways, and it's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, this is not air. These are pulverized building solids, and they occur at speeds up to 200 feet per second, and they occur in an engineered pattern. And besides, if this was air being produced by this non-existent pile driver, we would expect it to fill that open office planning space uniformly somewhat, and then maybe blow out all the windows on that floor. Not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that occur in this often in a fairly engineered pattern, sometimes at the center of the facade of these buildings. And here in the South Tower, at the onset of its destruction, on the left side, over and over again, you can see these ejections, dozens of them, occurring all at once, indicating simultaneous failure or disintegration inside the building. And they are pulverized building solids, up to 60 feet down. How fast is the building coming down? NIST says 9 or 10 seconds. Now that's essentially free fall, as they acknowledge. But let's see ourselves as we set these in motion. 5 seconds, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. In a dozen or so seconds, this building is completely destroyed, shattered from top to bottom. Now, let's just look. Let's listen to David Chandler, physics teacher, who actually did an analysis on this speed, much more than Much more work than the NIST put into it, actually. Yeah, let's listen.
We're here tracking the motion of the roof line at 0.2 second intervals for approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roof line as a function of time. This is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall. In other words, once it starts falling, the upward resistive force is only 36% of the weight of the falling section of the building. So far, so good. But now turn it around. Newton's third law says interactions between objects work both ways. The forces two objects exert on each other are always equal and opposite. If the upward force acting on the falling block is 36% of the weight of the falling block, the downward force exerted by the falling block must be exactly the same, 36% of the weight of the falling block. In other words, the top section of the building is exerting less force on the lower, stronger, undamaged structure than it would if it were simply sitting motionless. Therefore, as long as the top section of the building is in uniform downward acceleration, it cannot possibly be providing sufficient force to destroy the building.
Another way to look at this is, first of all, the amount of steel that has to be crushed in order for this building to collapse. 100,000 tons, to be exact, maybe 80,000 tons underneath the point of jet plane impacts. As if it weren't even there, because this building is accelerating. It's getting faster and faster. It's not decelerating. It's not slowing down at all. In other words, these columns are not doing the work that they're capable of. Let's look at it this way. You hold a 15-story section of this building, like the North Tower, above the point of jet plane impacts, with a crane, over nothing at all on the right. And on the left, we put, say, 80,000 tons of structural steel framing designed to resist that load 5 times stronger than it needed to be in order to resist that load. Now we're going to pull the lever and drop these all at once. What happens? The building on the right is going to fall at free fall because there is no resistance, because there is no columns. The building on the left is going to slow down. This is intuitive. We learn this, we get it. Even in the 7th grade, we understand this. But NIST's theory would have us believe that those columns weren't even there, even though they were. So what happens? Let's listen to Massimo Mazzucco from the New Pearl Harbor, September 11th.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics. And our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
This is why we have 2,700 architects and engineers calling for a new investigation. This is why we have peer-reviewed papers, any published, like this one, reprinted from the International Journal of Protective Structures by Gregory Zdulinski and Tony Zambodi and Richard Johns. Let's look at the total dismemberment of the steel structure. Is that the case? How does a building that falls due to natural causes completely dismember into its individual structural elements where the steel frame is completely shattered. And of course, outside the footprint that you see here of the Twin Towers, cut up, ready for loading and shipment into the original lengths of the beams, columns. Do we have a lateral ejection of these steel elements? Well, take a look at these freely flying structural steel sections, individually freely flying, landing 300 to 600 feet away. Let's focus on this one for a second. This one is traveling forward, back 2, 3, forward 2, 3, back 2, 3, forward 2, 3. This is a 45-degree angle. The lateral component of this element, which is clocked at 60 or 80 miles an hour laterally, is not accountable by the official story, which is a gravitational collapse. Gravity works down. Something else, like explosives, for instance, can work out. In fact, there's enough explosive power there to send that 4-ton structural steel unit up to 600 feet away, as much as firing a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. This is an explosive force. And such a force may account also for the missing floors, because in a pancaking collapse, we would be looking for 110 stacked up floors, like we see on the right in a real gravitating collapse. At the Twin Towers, we see a 2, 3, 4-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns. Where are the 110 floors? We have a hard time finding any of them. So what happened to them? They're composed of 90,000 tons of concrete. What happened to that concrete? It's not at the base of the tower. It's not outside the towers, at least not in any form we can recognize. What happened to it? Well, it's being pulverized in midair. What is pulverizing the concrete in midair at the onset of the destruction of this building? Not when it develops its gravitational potential energy and comes all the way down to the ground. No, it is being pulverized into 100 micron particles on average, spread river to river across lower Manhattan in a 4-inch thick pile of powder. 30% of the dust is composed of this fine concrete powder. That takes tremendous mechanical energy or explosive energy. The governor of New York puts this in perspective.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? Concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were 10,000 or so file cabinets, but this is the only one that survived. It was in the basement. And where are 10,000 file cabinets, which theoretically in a gravitational collapse should be found between about 110 floors, along with the people? But something else happened to the people.
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how in
God's name did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments, a half an inch long, found on top of building across the tower. How did they get so small? How did they get there? They didn't come from the people in the plane that hit the South Tower. It sent its ejections out this way. It didn't come from the people in the plane that hit the North Tower, because the South Tower blocks those ejections from arriving on top of the Deutsche Bank building. Let's look at this. There's a gruesome set of statistics. A total of 2,749 victims. Only 300 whole bodies were found. 20,000 pieces of bodies altogether were found. 6,000 small enough to fit into a test tube. And still, 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, 1,151 victims remain completely unaccounted for, vaporized. No trace. What can explain that in a gravitational collapse? Look at the distribution of these people from the victim tracking database of the FDNY. These body parts are found 800, 1,000 feet away from the Twin Towers. How is that explained? There's more pieces found well outside the perimeter of the towers than not. Can a gravitational collapse explain the pulverization, the distribution? We believe that the hypothesis of explosive demolition is corroborated. But what you think? Do we have so far in this part, this first part of the Twin Towers evidence presentation, do we have the key characteristics of explosive demolition? We'll get to the incendiary evidence next week. Can fire explain any of these, let alone all of them? Do we have additional corroborative circumstantial evidence that supports proof of controlled demolition? This is the question we ask ourselves as technical and building professionals, as members of the American Institute of Architects, who rubber stamped, basically, with few minor suggestions for changes in the final report, but basically buying off on the theory put forth by NIST of the initiation of collapse by fire, the explosive evidence that NIST ignored. And we can't expect the AIA to conduct their own fully fledged investigation. They're not resourced. But we can call for a new investigation. And that's what we're doing today. And that's what we're asking you to join us to do. Sign the petition at AE911Truth. Become a member of AE911Truth. We have 2,000 supporting, sustaining monthly donors at $2.50 a month, $10, $25 a month. You will find your level of support that is commensurate with your level of concern that this evidence in the last 15 years has not been brought the American people or to us as architects, 80,000 members of the American Institute of Architects, or engineers, members of the American Society of Civil Engineers, Structural Engineers Association. We do have 100 structural engineers. They are on our petition. Join them and donate to AE911Truth so that we can go to the AIA conferences, conventions, educate members as we do every year. But we need increasing levels of support to support new efforts at going to more conventions to reach additional architects, and so that we can get to the bottom of what really happened here, because we know nor are we criminal. We don't have the resources, the skills to find out who may be responsible for this. We certainly want to know, but we need for real investigation, and it won't happen without you. So don't sit idly by to do the vital work that needs to be done. Some of that is volunteer work, and I'm asking you to consider volunteering with us. Andy Steele is here. And Andy, what kind of work can we invite our listeners to support?
Yeah, a lot of important information shared here today. A lot of work that should have been done by responsible parties is now being done by AE911Truth, and it's a lot of effort and a lot of work that goes into doing this. So we have various outreach efforts going on involving reaching out to building professionals, reaching out to government people in the Congress. So we need your help with that, with getting some of that work done, taking some of the load off of us here. So if you're interested in just putting in a few hours a week to really help out with this important effort, then please go to ae911truth.org, click the volunteer tab, and fill out the short box. We will be in touch with you, and we'll get you on a task. And every little bit counts.
Thank you, Andy. That's awesome. Please do join us, folks. It's really important. And right now, from your own place of work or at home, you can send out to your elected representatives, television representatives, radio, newspaper, media. Send the AE911truth.org link to everybody you know, every architect and engineer that you can find. This is information that your colleagues, friends, family members deserve to know. It is uncomfortable. Agreed. The implications of this are difficult. But after all, look what happened since 9/11. We've been engaged in a $4.5 trillion global war on terror over the terror events that happened on 9/11. We have lost valuable civil liberties, which our forefathers fought for. Any of us can now be arrested, held indefinitely. No right to a lawyer, a jury, a trial. We can be held without charge, and we can even be tortured or assassinated. American citizens, I'm referring to, by the way. So it's very important, given this state of affairs, that we do something. We've invaded 2 countries in which over a couple of million people have perished. If there's any question about what happened at the World Trade Center, don't we deserve an investigation that answers the questions that have been raised this week, on last week's webinar, and on next week's webinar, which I'll be very excited to introduce to you in a moment. So share these resources. Resources like this 50-page booklet that's been put out and distributed to 50,000 academic and professionals in the technical industry, architecture and engineering, goes through in detail what happened to buildings 1, 2, and 7, reviews the NIST report in detail. So we've also interviewed 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, who are all laying out the evidence in this well-produced documentary that leaves no stone unturned. In 90 minutes, you can get to the bottom of the evidence. You can share this with others. Let me show you a couple of minutes.
call conspiracy theories. And, you know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA and Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved. In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
That they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yes, organize a screening, share the free version of this incredible video with your friends. The link, just Google Experts Speak Out. The free 1-hour version is there. The 90-minute version is available in our store, which you can click on at the top of our website. The additional very helpful documentary, which features Eric Lawyer of firefighters for 9/11 Truth. Firefighters, architects, engineers expose 9/11 myths. We've toured, premiered it in 70 cities in a tour in 2016 all around the country. And it focuses on NIST's refusal to use the guidelines of the National Fire Protection Association, which it actually, it's Manual 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, and it actually assisted quite a bit in writing that manual. And yet, with regard to destruction of evidence that you just heard about, 400 truckloads a day being carted away from the site, the illegal destruction of evidence sent to China for recycling starting 2 weeks after 9/11 before investigators could even get to it. It's all documented there in that video. So we looked today at the explosive destruction. Next week, we'll be looking at the Twin Towers and extreme heat. Fascinating look at the pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter, and nanothermite. So all this is coming up next Thursday at 1 o'clock. And you can also look on the archive on our website or search YouTube for the Twin Towers and extreme heat, and see it right now from last month. Very exciting. But I'm sure we have some questions at this point, don't we, Andy?
Yes, we do. We got 3 questions today. The first one asks us, were the reports of explosions considered at all by the 9/11 Commission?
The 9/11 Commission, as well as NIST, ignored all of the hundreds of reports and witnesses of explosions for some unknown reason. In fact, the 9/11 Commission ignored the collapse of World Trade Center 7 altogether. No mention in the 571 pages. And NIST, of course, was tasked with explaining how and why all 3 towers collapsed. With regard to the Twin Towers, we'll see next week in the NIST, it's 20-year to a 3-year, $20 million effort to get at the heart of it. They stopped the analysis at the initiation of collapse with no effort whatsoever to try to explain what happened after the initiation of collapse. The capability of the cold, hard, intact steel below to resist some falling mass up above, completely ignored. They just simply relied on that paper that came out 2 days after 9/11 by Zdenek Bazant of their theory, and they say, well, the video showed that it came down, so we didn't have to try to figure that out. It's quite an incredible omission in and of itself. Andy, do you have anything else to add about reports of explosions by the 9/11 Commission?
By the 9/11 Commission, no, but there were those reports, and actually they're documented by Graham McQueen. I'm not sure if you just mentioned this, but Graham McQueen, a professor of peace studies, retired from Canada, published these in at least 118 first responders. He was very conservative with this paper, too. He looked at the descriptions that were given by the first responders and omitted statements that just said, oh, I heard a loud bang, or I heard a pop, because those could be any number of things. He looked for specific words like explosion and came up with at least 118 of them. So that's available in various places on the internet that people can read and should certainly cite when they're talking to others about this. Richard, I have another question here. This is one we commonly get. How long would an operation like this take to set up?
Well, we know from existing controlled demolitions that it takes months to engineer and plan and place these explosives. It takes dozens of operatives especially under tight time frames. We do know in the case of the Twin Towers that there was a 9-month elevator modernization going on in this building, in both buildings. The largest elevator modernization in the world, documented by Elevator World in March of 2000, before 9/11. So there was access through the elevator shafts, which were shut down one at a time and locked, by possibly a group of individuals with malintent, Ace Elevator particularly, whom we'd love to have an investigation of, who had access, therefore, to the core columns and beams in the building. And that's got to be investigated by criminal investigators. So there's a possibility for getting explosives, incendiaries into the building itself.
Okay. Our last question today asks us, how under control were the fires by the time the towers came down?
Well, I wouldn't use because the firefighters had a heck of a time accessing due to the height and all the people coming down and evacuating the building. But what we do know is the fires put themselves out, and especially in the case of the South Tower, where there's just a few small flames after 56 minutes of burning. The South Tower, which was the second tower to get hit, comes down first after just 56 minutes, even though the fires were going out. So that raises questions, of course, in and of itself. But 10 minutes prior to that tower coming down, as we'll see next week, we have molten iron or steel pouring out of that tower. It turns out to be molten iron as well. When we investigate this, you don't have all of this evidence of all of this molten iron without an incredibly unique source. Of course, it is the byproduct of the incendiary thermite, which we'll get to next week. So I encourage everybody to come. In the case of the North Tower, the fires were hotter. They certainly weren't under control. But what we want to emphasize is that we're not arguing with structural engineers or fire protection engineers about the capability of the steel to resist fire. We're just not going to even need to go there. We will give them that entire argument. What we are presenting to building professionals is the evidence of explosive destruction, which in the case of today's webinar was irrefutable and overwhelming. Next week's the evidence of incendiaries is, as you'll see, irrefutable. And that's the argument that will induce, we hope, 50% at least of the American Institute of Architects at the annual convention in Orlando in late April to vote for the resolution that calls upon the AIA to support a new investigation into the destruction of Building 7. That resolution focuses on Building 7. And 2 years ago, we succeeded in bringing that with 50 co-sponsors, AIA members who have signed our petition, to the floor. It was voted on by 400 members. And we got a lot of votes, but not enough to win. We got 3 times that many votes last year. And this coming year, in 2017, we expect to get 3 times again. And it's a slow building process that's supported by a major effort of ours to reach architects and engineers at the conventions that they go to, where we have a 10-foot or 20-foot wide booth supported again by our donors to educate these architects. And most of them don't even know a third tower came down. Most of them don't know this explosive and incendiary evidence relative to the first 2 towers. So we're doing an incredible service with the support of you, our petition signers and members. It's been an amazing piece of work, for which we look forward to continuing on. And we will do that next week when we get to the week week 4. Next week, we're going to be calling this part 3 of 9/11, an architect's guide, where we look at the pyroclastic-like clouds of molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. So join us next week, Thursday, 1 o'clock Pacific here. And thanks again, Andy, and thanks everybody. See you next week.